Hello, Endersword here again, this time with a tier list of every officer in Star Trek Fleet Command. We're going to be putting all 204 officers into 7 different categories based on how useful they are, how versatile they are, or how important they are for certain really key roles in the game. And then basically, I guess, try and help people decide what to invest their officer XP in, which ones to pursue, what things to make adjustments for, and maybe just kind of discuss some of the general uses of these officers that you encounter in the game. Obviously, this is going to change a bit depending on people's levels, people's play styles, and so on. So there may be some of these that you disagree with, and definitely like to hear about that down below, or any of these that maybe I've ranked not that useful that you have found some niche application for, or something that makes them stand out to you. But there are tons of these, so without delaying too much, we'll get to the start. I'm going to start off by saying that a lot of these mining specific officers, like 3 of 11, where you've got a boost either to overall mining speed or to a specific material that they're going to help you collect, are generally going to top out at the B tier to me, because they just kind of have that one use. If it's the case that some have use well beyond that, then they could potentially break higher or lower depending what it is. But I think there's a lot of these officers that are kind of generically your mining ones that I'm going to have about the same level. So 3 of 11, obviously great with gas. 10 of 11 is going to help with overall mining speed. Its captain ability helps you with dilithium, parsteel, and tritanium, though. So its usefulness by the time you actually acquire this officer is probably not going to be something that you need that much. But the overall speed is good, and the fact that they synergize with the other Borg certainly helps out. 11 of 11, very similar to the 3 of 11 in that it does help with mining speed for crystal. We've got 1 of 11 that is helping out with the bodyguard ability, protected cargo. 4 of 11 is perhaps a little better, but not enough to me to jump it to an A tier. But there's sets of officers, 2 of 11 being one of them, that also increase your cargo capacity. That can be a little bit useful outside of just the mining. It can increase things like, say, a Voyager, if you want to load more onto it, or something like an amalgam, can help out there. But I think largely they don't quite broach into that super important everyday use beyond just the mining capacity there. The first little bald man here, Officer 718 or whatever, I think they cut off the O for some reason in the picture, 0718, is going to be my first almost useless officer. He does have some niche use in some early away team missions, as he does have some abilities there that you can level up. And I think he has some use potentially as a defender on your station, but other than that, you're never going to put him on a ship. You're never going to take him out of the dock, so he's going in a D. Similarly, we got Avix going in the same spot. Here, no niche use. You may use this as essentially a stat officer on away teams, but that's just about it. Other than that, never going to leave the dock, never going to be on a combat ship or anything. The next 3 here, however, are Borg officers. We've got 9, 8, and 7. These are more the combat-focused Borg, and they do have a bit of a niche use in the early game when you first get something like the Vidar. These can be helpful on that to provide an alternate crew to just the PMT that you would often use, and before you have something like a 5 of 11. To help out there. So these can definitely provide some niche combat advantages. It's not super strong, so I wouldn't rank them much higher, but they do actually have a place on a crew every now and then. Arium is going to go in the same sort of mining area, obviously specifically for ISO mining in this case, but really good on a Meridian, has good synergies, and will often just stay there to mine ISO for you. Eric's is one of the ones that I would probably again say D, that may show up in a away team just for stats, but other than that, probably would never be used. And Arcady is going to be our first F. The reason for that, he's got a lot of abilities that even as a very early player, you've got a better officer that does the same thing. So as a captain's ability can provide morale, but you're going to have somebody like Kirk very quickly into the game. He has the engineering away team trait, but you also very early get in the game, get other people that have that engineering trait that are going to be better to send on the mission. So Arcady kind of is your first really never going to use the guy officer, probably past like level 15 or something like that. Iraq is also going to go into our kind of good minor category. And Zetber is going to sit in the near useless, but you can occasionally use for stats category. Badgie, these guys, I kind of, not 100% useless, but they made them really, really light. So the way that these work for some of the original below deck officers is just the impact that they have on stats is so minor because it is a percentage based on base of your ship as opposed to based on the stats of the other officers on the ship. So instead of being like 40% of the defense of the crew, it's just 40% of the original piercing or original defense of the crew. And that unfortunately is barely noticeable. So it's kind of if your stats are maxed and if you've got an empty spot and if you don't have any other below deck officers, then you could shove this on. But now that there's much better below deck officer choices to make, Badgie kind of is getting demoted from probably a C originally down to a D of like a nearly useless. But it was interesting they went this route. They're just so weak compared to everything else in the game. Bael kind of falls in the same category of you might throw on an away team to just help out, but isn't really doing much. Barrett is going into our kind of same as the other minors tier. Beckett Mariner is going to be our first one to make it up really past an A and will be in our S category. So she is a pretty decent below deck officer, has good stats, and she is an epic officer when you level her up a bit. And there is, I wouldn't say good sourcing for her, but reasonable-ish sourcing through the Cerritos. And you can buy her with the transporter patterns. So she's not as locked out as some of the other officers are. So you can actually get her as an epic up to a decent level. And her main function, obviously, is to increase the base weapon damage that you do. It says stuff like, 140%, I think mine is at. In reality, that translates to like 8% on most of my ships, but that is still a significant push. So if you've got your stats maxed out already and you're looking for a below deck officer, this is one that you can definitely stick on there. Balana Torres, I'm going to put into the A category. She's going to have a use with potentially the other Voyager crew in Armadas specifically. You're probably not going to tend to run her much outside of the Voyager in hostile hunting. It wouldn't fit on most other ships, but she could synergize with Janeway to help provide extra defense there. And her below deck ability of providing a potential hull breach at the tier that you get her is way too small to count on. I think it starts at a 10%, but if you're able to tier that up over the course of time, then she could become a more beneficial below deck officer. At 10%, it's too low to be counted on. Once you get that up to like tier 4, tier 5, much later on, then there's some potential there, but I wouldn't really put her in the top tier just yet. We've got Benjamin Sisko, who I'm also going to put at an S. He's one of the best Armada officers. The sourcing for him is actually pretty good through the Dominion Solar Armada chests without putting any money into him. I've almost got him maxed out. I think I'm about 150 shards away from completely maxing on him. So you didn't have to really invest into him or anything. Over time, he'll come. The fact that he is both providing extra crits and he provides defense as the captain is actually quite good. And he can work well with different officers from the DS9 arc. Usually I've got him with Changeling Kira and Miles, but you can slip in for solos, mixes with Julian, Jadzia, and some other things there. But he's definitely a good one. He can also be used in place of where you use Khan on some other armadas. So if you're looking to make a crew and either Khan is tied up on an away team, something like that, Cisco at a high enough tier is actually quite good at raising your crit rate as well. So I think he's definitely up there as a super versatile one. Baator, her specialty is the amalgam, but she does that specialty very well. So she kind of really helps boost the amalgam's special ability, which is to take a percentage of everything that a base has, and she is going to enhance that ability. So it's definitely key to have her there. She's another one that's hard to specifically source. So even after all this time, I've only got her at a tier 3, but she is definitely a good officer to have on. You'd usually end up with her plus 2 cargo enhancing officers on your amalgam to help you take bigger scoops out of things. Beverly Crusher is one that I used to have probably at an S tier because she is providing defense on the wings of any armada that you're doing, but there's now other officers that kind of fill in for that ability a little bit better. So she's a little more of a potentially early game Armada officer when you maybe don't have the DS9 people yet, the Voyager people yet, things like that. But she synergizes well with either Riker or Picard, and she can be definitely used on her own even to just enhance defense. So you could, what I was previously doing was using Jadzia, Julian Bashir, and her on a wing to provide some defense for a ship in solo armadas, kind of on my third ship. But now that there's other options, I've kind of moved her down a little out of an S tier and more into an A. So she's still there, still versatile, but is not necessarily the champion that she used to be. Bones here, you can see I had him on an away team at the time. Decent for sending on an away team, but again, he's never really getting on a ship past level 20 something really. Not much use for him there, but he does have a couple traits that he can be sent out. Borg Queen here has a niche use in that she does have a ability against solo Borg armadas, which is pretty niche. And it's enhancing the crit rate against those. But given that there's other officers now, I think 4 or 5 that will enhance the crit rate against armadas, she's not really necessary for that sort of thing, and you can get better things from other officers, certainly to the point that she's not going to be hugely different compared to them. Also, the way that she works is that she ramps up over time, while the Borg solar armadas tend to be really, really short fights. They tend to be 3 to 4 round fights and you're going to kill it. And if you don't kill it by then if it becomes a long fight, you're probably not going to win. So the fact that she ramps up kind of a bit slower is not really the best for it. She was originally kind of sold with the mindset of her below deck ability, but the Borg assimilate below deck ability is just really crappy. Really, that they were intending it to be a powerful thing that ramps up over the duration of a PvP fight, but PvP fights are pretty short. They only last usually 3 to 5 rounds is what you're going to get on 2 evenly matched ships. And given that she can't activate in round 1, the assimilation has to be done usually in round 2 because it requires hull damage be on the enemy ship. It just doesn't have time to become powerful, and they set it again based on the base of the other ship, not on your own officer stats or a multiplication of those. So it just doesn't work. It's too weak. They even enhanced the numbers after they released them to make them stronger, but it's still just way too weak. And given that you need to then take up 3 spots with this assimilation crew, if it was all in one, maybe you could make a case. But having the actual trigger of it and 2 other officers that make the piercing and defense go up is not really it's just not really viable. Usually you don't have room for that sort of thing. So she's got the niche use against Borg solos, but it's just way too niche. She's an okay stat officer, though, so you can stick around to enhance attack, I think, is her best value. Brad Boimler, really in the same area as Badgie, so kind of already discussed that. We've got the cadet crew, and see if I remember these correctly. We've got Cadet Kirk as an early officer. I think Cadet O'Hara, and then correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's McCoy that goes with them to create kind of an early pre-PMC crew that you can kind of use to be at least viable when fighting hostiles. But again, you're never really going to use this beyond your probably early 20s, and maybe even earlier than that now that they've got the, what are they called? The new missions, basically, for new players to unlock Pike, Moreau, and Chen a little bit earlier. So it's unlikely that you're going to be used that long, but they are still there and still kind of useful. Sulu, however, I don't believe has any use. However, Cadet Scotty is going in the A category because he can enhance your warp range. And one of the things that, despite all the power creep in the game, has still not really been readjusted is that at the low levels, you're able to kill things well beyond what your warp range ability is, but you can't get there. So very frequently, you're going to have to use these warp enhancing officers to get to a location to complete a mission or to complete a daily or something like that, just to get access to things that you want to be killing that, frankly, you just are kind of locked by that warp range. Captain Tilly is going to be going in the B category, I think. Used to be a much more valuable PvP officer. You can use her in combination with Lorca and Emperor Gregu or whatever, Giorgio, to make a fairly decent interceptor crew. However, because the strike team exists, because Pick Wharf exists, because other options exist, you're not going to be using that nearly as much. So it's the type of thing that you may put on a second or third interceptor ship, but you're not going to be generally using as your main one as long as you have access to those officers. So it is a bit of a backup sort of thing. Carol is an away team officer almost exclusively, however, is one of the best ones. So Carol helps you get massive amounts of the Federation credits. And anytime it's one of the officers that has the all three abilities or two or more abilities for one of the high yielding away team credits, or not away team credits, but Federation credits from away team or faction credits from away team, then I'm going to prioritize them. Later in the game, that gets really, really big, to the point that now on my away teams, you're getting 6,000 plus Federation credits in this case when you land a critical success, and maxing out those three abilities can definitely lead to like a 75% plus critical chance. So later in the game that becomes valuable, but even all the way throughout, just having that extra faction credit income is going to help you source blueprints and other officers and things like that. So I do tend to prize a couple of those fairly highly. A Cath here, I've never really used, can be again an alternate sort of crew for PMC, can kind of fill in and do kind of a partial job compared to those. I've never really been in the habit of doing it, but some people that have unlocked her have found some success there. Again, the issue is sourcing with her, that she's not really freely available. So it's very likely that your PMC crew and kind of the more traditional stuff is going to be a lot better than she is at the time. Chakotay, I'm going to put into an S. Obviously a relatively new officer, but the fact that he increases crit rates and he fires extra shots just makes him a purely offensive powerhouse of an Armada guy. So people are still playing around with some of the best synergies and best uses for him there, but he's kind of a combination of that crit officer with that Miles style thing. But instead of being a chance to increase shots, he just straight up increases shots. So it's miles without the coin flip, basically, which makes him a lot more reliable, and he can definitely anchor a Armada crew. We've got Chang here, which goes to me in the D category of you're going to use him on away teams. Changeling Kira, I'm going to put in the debatable here whether you say S or A. She's obviously meant to be used with Cisco. And I think I'm going to lean that way, that she's kind of the active officer here that makes this good. What she's going to do is lower the attack value, based on your attack value, will lower the structure that you're fighting, the armada that you're fighting, lower its defense. So it's good in a group armada when you're dealing with other people. It will lower the defense for everybody that is participating in it. Or in your solo armadas, having the Cisco, Changeling Kira, and Miles crew is going to lower it for the rest of your ship. So while there's other officers that occasionally increase your piercing and your damage, what Changeling Kira does is kind of social, that it applies to everybody, and that's what makes it a bit more valuable. And if you've got multiple Changeling Kiras on the same target, again, you're just going to drain away the defenses of that armada fairly quickly, depending on what your attack values are. Charvanek, I'm going to put in the same category and same purpose as Carol, although Charvanek does have some actual extra use that you would occasionally put her on a combat ship, specifically when you are fighting, I believe, battleship targets out there. If you need to kill a mission hostile, you'll sometimes slip Charvanek on. Used to have a lot more use in PvP when you had to worry more about the battle triangle and which specific type of ship you were fighting, kind of in the pre-strike team days. The usage there has fallen out quite a bit now that you don't have to worry about that as much. The strike teams are generally the answer, no matter what you're fighting. Even though you've got a disadvantage on the triangle, they're still better than trying to use a lot of those officers. Chen, I think, is going to be the first one that I put in an S+. She is just the best officer for hostile grinding before level 52, basically. Chen lowers the energy weapon damage that the opponent is doing, which is going to be the thing that you need in most cases. There's niche cases where you're going to use Talon instead of Chen, when you're going to be dealing with more kinetic weapons. But for most ships, Chen is going to be the thing that you're doing. So whether it's just hostile grinding, faction grinding, anything you're doing, Chen is kind of your answer, and she's the big key to making that whole thing work. Kolber, I'm going to put in a D. Really, the only use here is to synergize with other officers such as Arium to help with the mining. Other than that, not a huge amount there. And we get to our other one that I consider S+, and that is Damar. So Damar is the key ingredient to the Interceptor strike team. The way that he works is that he lowers the critical damage that your opponent does each time a shot hits a critical. So he is basically sapping away the critical damage from your opponent and can actually turn that to a negative number. So you can get in a fight, interceptor to interceptor being the most classic, where your opponent now hits literally 0 damage, that they've gotten their crit rate up to 100%, and so every single shot they fire is reduced, or actually reduced all the way to 0, so they literally can't hurt you anymore. Damar is the key to making that work. And depending on how high you have him tiered up, the faster that's going to happen. So he's kind of the key to the whole thing. If you take 2 evenly matched ships and put them against each other, the ship that has the higher Damar is pretty much going to win that fight 99% of the time, and can definitely help you punch way above your own head by sucking away the critical damage that they do and reducing it to nothing, or effectively nothing, much less. So he's kind of the king there. Darwin goes into the useful for XPing up your ships category, which I'll call a C. you're not going to use it for most of your main combat, but particularly when it comes up to leveling up a ship to try and scrap it, or just kind of trying to accelerate through levels as you tiered up, Darwin can help out with that. And there's a few more officers in the same category. Data is an interesting one. Data I have not yet even sourced yet, and is possibly one of the most rare officers in the entire game, and yet basically has no use outside of away teams. So has a very mild like plus critical damage against armadas, but I think only as the captain, and really just isn't something that you would use. But data is data, and everybody wants data. But for some reason, the artificial scarcity of data doesn't totally make sense, but they've always kind of held that back. He's available in away team missions, but those come up few and far between, and you have to crit it to get it. So you're probably a lot of people probably have not unlocked data or have him at a very low tier, and yet he's useless. So I kind of consider data a bit of a collectible, but he's there, and whatever. Not 100% useless, but basically useless. Deanna, though, I am going to put Deanna in. I don't know if she's an A or a B. She's better than. She has a niche use that I'm going to say that she's a B. So she's obviously got use against Romulan armadas, although you're usually better off just running another crew that is better in the first place. But she does synergize well with the Picard, Beverly, and Troy sort of thing. She can help out in the Romulan armadas. Where she does have the niche use that makes her very valuable, though, is the Cardassian armadas. All you need is one person in a Cardassian armada against a rare or epic one to run Troy as captain. So the way that the Cardassian armadas work, they have the uncommon ones have a crit rate, and every round the crit rate increases until it hits 100. And that's why we use Gala on those. But Troy, on the epic ones and rare ones, the crit rate does not increase. It starts at 20% and it doesn't go up. However, the strength that those armadas hit with crits is 450%. Whereas most of the armadas out there, when they hit a crit, it's like 150%. So it's a little higher, but it's not out of this world. Whereas the rare and epics really shoot a very, very strong shot whenever they crit. By getting anyone in the armada to use Troy as captain, and particularly if you then synergize her with another TNG officer, she's going to take that crit rate to 0 or almost 0. So if you put her and say Tasha Yar, then she's got a 20%, takes it down to 0. You will not get a crit the entire fight, and that just makes a giant difference. You're lowering those crits that were doing 5 times as much damage. You're going to be cutting the entire damage of the armada just about in half for the entire thing, and that can often make the difference between winning or losing, because I've seen those things just get some lucky crits and take out some really big ships, and Troy will prevent that from happening. But again, it's a very niche use, an important one, but a very niche use. Decius is pretty good for early armada stuff. He increases the weapon damage that you're doing by 10% per round. So you see a lot of early game Kirk, Spock, Decius type stuff. I think with other officers out there, he's not as important anymore, even in the early game. Past that, you're not going to use him, but he's there, and you can throw him on some stats and stuff later. I think he has the warrior trait or something, but early game, maybe some use, later on, not too useful. Dezok falls in that same category as the Borg Queen a bit, in that there is some niche use there. He is, however, the one that activates the thing. So if you're going to use one of the 3, then you're going to have to use him. So you can get the assimilate if you've got extra below deck space, and you kind of just have nothing better to put on, then put him on. He can trigger the assimilate, which will lower the abilities of the opponent's officers in PvP. So he's kind of PvP only, and something that you'd probably use by himself instead of with the other ones. But if you have to pick one of the 3, he's one of the 3, but still, I'm not going to put him higher than a B, because I think they just miscalibrated the entire thing and how it works. Dixon Hill here, maybe a C. He's kind of a very minor increase for your mining abilities, but he's below deck, and most of the time your miners aren't going to have below deck spots filled anyway, so you might as well stick him on a ship. But I don't know, cute character, but didn't really have anything super special. But I think he is the only one that actually increases mining from below decks at this point, so might as well stick him in there. DJ Aoki is a DJ in Las Vegas, and it doesn't make any sense that he's in the game in the first place, other than apparently he likes the game. He's got the warrior ability, I think, which again is in earlier away teams is often needed a lot. So I'll stick him in a D, but he's never going to be on while he does have some very niche use on a ship that you will, I guess people don't really do it anymore, but I think he's got the enhanced damage against Romulans. And I say that, I'm not sure, one of them, but I think it's Romulans. That you may stick him on, synergize with other things to fight a very specific ship. But nowadays, that's not really relevant anymore. So, put him in the D category. Damita is going to also go in the D category. She has the ability Hurry Home. So it is basically going to increase your warp speed coming back with a full survey ship or a full cargo. However, there's not really a ton of cases where you're going to have a full cargo and be worried about your warp speed back. It's more kind of on your warp speed out that you tend to care about. And depending on, I guess, the server you're on and everything, how often are you going to have a completely full cargo space and really care about the extra 20 seconds to get home or something like that? So I think just certainly not enough to slaughter on the ship anyway. So some of these are good for very, very early mining, but not super important after that. DuPont is going to go into that B mining category. Again, he's kind of on his own, so doesn't synergize as much with some of these other folks, but decent mining officer. Tendi here is going to increase the hull HP, and I think it fits in the A category. So reasonable increase to the hull depending on what level you can get her to. And now that they've actually added her to the transporter pattern store, you can potentially get her to a higher tier and make her more useful. However, it's one of those things again where something that says it's a 200% increase to your hull, when you actually look at it, is like a 4% increase to your hull. There's so many other things in the game that give hull boosts, from research to buildings, other officers, things like that. Her doing it below deck certainly helps, but you generally are going to want more damage, more other abilities down there. And if you have to, hull certainly helps out. Definitely an A, just not the absolute best below deck officer, but certainly a very good one. But I'd almost always take the extra damage provided by Mariner over the extra hull provided by Tendi as a percentage of the total. Generally, the increase in weapons damage is going to be higher compared to it because there's less things that increase the weapon damage. There's still a lot, but there's less than there are that increase the hull. Emperor Giorgio, we're going to stick, just stick in that B category. Again, the Tilly, Giorgio, and Lorca crew does work pretty well. I think high enough that it's still viable in today's game if you don't have the strike teams. So I think that's kind of one of the better ones that still survives. So we'll stick her there. Eurydice is going to be, to me, a C. There's some niche use for her, like very specific stuff where she can recharge your shields randomly, but it's not consistent, but she'll recharge 5% of the value of your shields or something. But her main use is going to be in away teams. There's certain away team missions that she does thrive at. So we're going to put her in the C category, but not something you're typically going to have on a ship. 5 of 11 is the best officer in the game, and there's not even a second place. Like, really should be in a tier completely on her own. She provides defense for the ship, and she provides extra loot for the ship, and synergizes with one of the best Armada officers. And you can basically use her for almost anything. So the fact that she provides the extra defense means that she's really good for both hostile grinding and armadas. She can be used even as a pinch in PvP. There's no restriction for using her against the yellow mission hostiles as well. So where something like PMC doesn't work against those, she still does. So can really be used in almost every situation in the game, aside from, I guess, mining. But she's going to increase your faction, going to increase your broken parts, going to increase anything that you're picking up in the game that you're trying to farm. She's generally going to be adding to that. And because she's providing defense, which is fairly decent on her own, you can stick on a synergy officer or just leave her. And if you need it a little more but don't want to synergize, you can use Tom Paris now. So she's really just kind of a hyper versatile officer, and still a bit hard to source for sure in the game, but you can kind of slowly get her super powerful. She's going to speed up basically everything you're doing, from the faction grind to the parts hunting to the Dominion drops and everything, Eclipse code drops, anything that you want. She's obviously going to help with that. And there's some key officers she synergizes with that actually make it even better. And we're going to get to one in another minute or two. So I won't jump ahead. Fez here, I'm going to stick in the B category. Again, good mining officer. Weirdly has, I don't know. I basically always keep the 3 Ferengi together. They are never separate, and you just kind of switch around which one is captain depending on what you're trying to do. But yeah, just a strong mining officer there. Gala is another one that has a strong, good niche use, and I'm actually going to put her in the A because she's kind of an officer that you can always get value out of, even if you're not the biggest the biggest dog in the Armada. So really an Armada officer, obviously. She's very key to the Cardassian Armadas. If your leader is using like Pike Moreau Gala or Picard Beverly Gala or something similar, then other people in that Armada also use Gala. You can get to a point where the Armada is doing 0 damage to your party. I mentioned earlier that the armadas, the uncommon armadas for Cardassians, increase the rate at which they do crits over the duration of the fight by 10% per round. So by the time you get to round 8, it's critting 100% of the time. What Gala does, if you've got enough of them, is reduces that to literally 0 damage. Her main officer ability is that she's going to take 50% of the critical damage away, and you need 3 of those to stack and reduce it to absolutely 0 when the leader is running with the synergy of either Pike or Picard. So super useful there. But even outside the Cardassian ones, if you're with your alliance and you're not like the biggest one out there, but you want to help out, if you could bring the weakest ship in the world, and as long as you put Gala on there, then she's going to reduce the critical hit damage against everyone for that fight. So you can be helping out by just reducing the repair bills of your entire alliance by doing that. So I think she does kind of stand out as a particularly useful one. You're not going to use her so much if you're the strongest person there, but it's something that everyone can contribute in and kind of play their part and just lower the damage of crits, basically. So she's strong. On to Strike Team Garrick. I think he's going into the S tier. He's going to be the one that's ramping up your critical hits. So very important officer there. Really, there's no misses in the Interceptor Strike Team. They're all good. I kind of consider it the best one of the two. Although some people say the Battleship. All we have to agree on is that the worst one is the Explorer one. But Garrick is going to ramp up those crits, and the higher tier you are, the faster he's going to do that, and the more he's going to overpower any anti-crit officer that the other side has. So if they've got something that is lowering the crit rate or suppressing it like the Explorer team does, he's going to quickly overpower that if he's a higher tier. So Garrick is definitely huge, just not as important as Damar. Jordy, I think we're going to put in the same B category. He's got the bonus of providing extra loot for your armada. However, he kind of does it at the expense of not being the best officer. So it's a bit of a case of you're only going to use him in that position when you're already confidently killing things like your solo armadas. You may stick him on one of the ships to increase the loot that you're getting, but you're not going to be doing it in a situation where you're really trying to punch up or do the maximum damage. You're only going to use him in stuff where you're already very comfortably killing things. So it's not really his strength you're looking at. It's just kind of that loot bonus that you're going for. But the fact that he does synergize with the other TNG officers, he's not useless. He's just not the best. And it's more for that. It's just for the bonus loot, not for much else. Giorgio, the non-Emperor version, is probably going to go... If she was the only one, I would say A. I'm going to say, maybe I'll still just say A. Basically, her and Nero are almost interchangeable. The way that they work is a little bit different in the consistency of how often they give the burning. And given that Nero is a lot easier to get for new players, Giorgio doesn't really have great sourcing. Even at this point, I've only got the tier 1 of her. But she's got about an equal effectiveness to Nero at that point, but it would get better. She's great for the burning-based crews, so to use with Tal is pretty key. If you get a higher tier, then she can be better than Nero. However, at the base level, like her at tier 1, Nero at tier 5, which a lot of people are going to have, they're almost equal, and if anything, Nero is actually a little bit better. But for that niche use, she's there. She's also kind of useful to some away teams. There's one person away team that she'll often be good at, and I'm almost talking myself into lowering her to a B. So I think it is kind of the niche use of only when you're using the Tal specific burning crew is she really that important. And given that there's also an alternative, I guess I'm having a hard time saying that she's going to be an A, so I will stick her at a B there, even though it's a use. It's not a use that only she controls. Nero does, to me, just as well, if not better. But it depends on the level that you've got the two officers actually at. Galinar is going to at least make an A for me. One is he's just a time-saving officer. So you can put him below decks when you're doing your Borg grinding and when you're doing your Actian grinding, and those things can be just a chore to do. So the fact that he's adding extra loot to either of those things is going to help out just in your day-to-day. It's going to be a big time saver that you're not going to have to kill as many, and it's going to potentially, if you're still struggling to fill your hull, obviously is going to help you, expand that and actually redeem more of the refinery turn-ins and so on. So he's super helpful there. Where he also fits in with a really good synergy is with 5 of 11. So his officer ability, which you won't often use him for, is extra faction as well. So if you're trying to fully maximize the faction that you're getting, having 5 of 11 with extra drops, having Galinar with the extra faction help, and Galinar provides 5 of 11 400% synergy, increases the defense of your ship by quite a bit. So you can kind of do those high-level targets that you'd usually need one of the other crews like PMC or S&W for, still fight in a fairly efficient way, but be really maximizing out what faction you're getting for it by using that. So I think he's almost more useful than they maybe intended when they came out with the guy, but he is quite good, and the sourcing for him is fairly reasonable now through the Solo Armada Borg refinery stuff, you can get a decent return and level him up. I won't say fast, but reasonably. There is sourcing for the guy. So he's definitely an option there, and it's definitely going to help increase your faction grind as well as just that daily stuff. And anything that's lowering that screen time by 30 minutes a day or something is definitely helpful. Grush is probably going to go in the S tier for me. He is I think he's the best stats officer in the game. So I think there's no one better below decks basically than him. He's got all three stats very, very high. His overall power is very, very high. And then the fact that he also gives extra warp range as a percentage of the ship is also huge. So you can stick him in to get extra warp range on your key fighting ships when you need to get to something to either finish a mission, daily, whatever it is. He can be the one that helps you with that. Slightly less important now with the Voyager in the game, but I still think pretty important, as there's times you need to get a big fighting ship somewhere just to kill a target or just to hit a waypoint in order to complete a mission chain, and he can kind of be the one that helps get you there. S may be mildly pushing it, but it's just anytime, if you kind of say, how often do you use him? I almost use him 100% of the time. He is on one of the two top fighting ships I have 100% of the time, because he's the one that then maxes all the stats out. So then you can put any below deck officers you want on top of that. And if he wasn't as strong, you wouldn't be able to do that. You'd have to be worrying about your attack, defense, and health and whatever. He can kind of take care of that almost single-handedly at this point, and then your other three can be whoever you want, regardless of what their tier and personal stats actually are. Gonzalez here is going to be going D tier. Basically has one purpose in early game away teams. Haven't really used her much since then, but kind of is one of the only officers that has the diplomacy trait, I think it is. And so there's some niche use there, but you're not going to really put her on a ship or anything like that. Goon falls in the same sort of maybe early game extra XP sort of thing, but other than that, you're not really going to use the guy too much, as there's much better things. There's this whole little sub crew that's kind of designed to fight Eclipse hostiles, but you just don't need them. The other crews are better than they are. So even though that was clearly the intent of some of these guys, it just doesn't really work out that way, and you don't need them. Gorkon is going to go in an A. Gorkon is an almost as good as Lorca officer, but more likely to actually have him. Gorkon has really high attack values, so it can be really good for below decks, and can be used as a potential replacement if you don't have somebody like a Gul Dukat or a Lorca to trigger crews that need hull breach. So you can use Gorkon as well with something like a Tilly or Emperor Giorgio, or in any case that you need to trigger that hull breach and you don't really have Lorca available to do it. So he's a bit of a potential fill-in. Also good in some of the niche away teams when it comes to the Klingon Empire, which isn't the faction that I'm largely pushing, but definitely is important there. So I think sits in an A. In terms of there's kind of the three epic officers, Kirk, Gorkon, and Nero, and Gorkon definitely has a solid place in that triumvirate. And definitely has niche uses, although Lorca can often fill in a bit better for him, and he often spends a lot of his time below decks enhancing the attack value of ships. Gosa is going to join our Borg Queen here, and I think actually a bit lower. Because the Borg Queen has higher stat values, you can use her as a below deck officer and has that specific against Armada stuff. Gosa doesn't really come with the same benefits. So again, I think a bit lower in the D category. I just view that entire below deck assimilate thing as a bit botched. overall. I tell what they were trying to do. They just executed it terribly. Even tried to raise the values and still failed. Gowron here is good for the same reason that Carol and Charmanek is, although he's the rare version of it, where you can help out with a lot of the Klingon away teams in giving you the Klingon faction credits there. So that's kind of his niche. Every now and then there's a rare situation where he may end up on a ship if you don't have a better crew for it, but not too much. He's mostly going to be a good away team guy given what his traits are. Gul Dukat is going to go in our S category here, along with his great friend Garrick, but is less important than the Damar side of it. Gul Dukat obviously super important still, but can be replaced if you don't have him, as he is, often harder to source. The epic version of those strike team people, you can replace him out with something like a Gorkon, a Lorca, a Pick Wharf, something like that if you don't have him, and still get your triggers off on Garrick and Damar. But the fact that he provides extra shots, he's obviously better than those guys. And the fact that he's 100% of the time certainly helps out as well. Hadley is going to go in the same category that I put Darwin. Again, good at farming up your XP, but outside that, not really something that you're going to use as the best officer to fight. It's just to farm and get your levels up on ships. Harrison here, I'm going to stick on an A. Not so much something you're going to use day to day. Is an excellent base defense officer. So has the ability to penetrate through the shields of your opponent in the first couple of rounds. And then that ability can be enhanced. So if you stick him with something like a pike, then it can increase that ability and make it so that it ignores the shields of your enemy completely for the first shots. So definitely a pretty important one there, and is also a really good punch up officer if you do put him on a ship and try and take him out. So there may be cases where you or your alliance are, in either a territory fight or incursion or just whatever you're in PvP, where there's an opponent out there that is just plain stronger than the rest of you. And you know that nobody has a ship that can just take this person out, but you still want to do damage to him. So one option is an officer like Harrison that is going to reduce the shield value that they have. So at the very least, while you're not going to kill this person, you know that every shot that you fire is going to go directly to their hull instead of being absorbed by their shields. So you can slowly whittle someone down a lot more. And it's often a lot more effective to do that. And even though the damage output is less, the amount that actually gets to their hull is a lot higher. So people try and do that with a Harrison. People try and do that with sometimes tall crews if you're going to survive more than a round or two. But Harrison is kind of I know you're going to blow me up in the first round or two, but I just want to get your paint scratched, and other people are going to do the same thing, and we're going to eventually take out your big expensive ship. So he's kind of the way to go for that sort of thing, and has some niche uses as well in some of the mission hostile things and some of the Q's trials now as well, given that there's some ships out there that have a focus on regenerating shields or just high shield value, and you need to kind of get under that. So has some niche use there as well. And he's one of those ones that's still hard to source, but as a base defender and so on, he's quite good. Harry Kim, I'm going to put lower than Torres. He's got kind of the nice ability that he also increases faction gain. However, there's not as much of a case for having him on the bridge as there is with some of the other crews. So it's probably not going to be one of your main faction grinder situations. He's probably going to be below deck, where you would have some use, particularly with some explorers like the Enterprise, where his morale is going to trigger some shield benefits. However, again, he's an officer that starts with such a low percentage to trigger that you're going to need to really level him up before he's something that you can count on as part of your main strategy. But it could help over the course of time as he gets up, or if it's in a group armada situation and it's a longer fight, him maybe helping you regenerate your shields on an Enterprise or something could pay off over a while, but I don't think he's as strong as a Torres. But it's still hard to see how some of the Voyager stuff's going to really play out as they all level up a bit. Harry Mudd here, I think kind of goes in the C category to me. The stats on him aren't that great for being an epic officer, so you're not going to have him below decks that much. He's got a fairly niche away team usage, so just overall not the best there. Some of his abilities were clearly designed for an era that is gone now, same as Eurydice and some of the other ones that were kind of in that Outlaw Eclipse sort of era. Their abilities and stuff just don't really make the most sense now, so aren't that important. Helvia here, I will put into the B category, as she increases the warp speed that you're at when you are empty. So the other mining officer was kind of when you're full and on your way home, but it's probably more useful at least to have higher warp speed when you're empty and you're looking for spots to go, getting out to deep space or whatever. You probably wouldn't use her much unless you don't really have enough of the other officers to fully fill out your mining crews, but she can be helpful there. If you do, she does synergize with some of the other folks like Barrett and Stan and stuff, so can help out there. Just increasing warp speed doesn't really help too much with the mining itself, but just because that warp speed can be daunting, especially early deep space time. Some warp times are like 6 to 10 minutes long, so that can be helpful. Hendorf, don't know why he got to be uncommon compared to the other guys, but basically is the same thing. XP growth officer, and same category as them. Honor Guard Worf used to be basically an S tier, maybe S plus officer. Now that there's alternatives to him, I think has to be lower. However, it's hard to say that it would still be lower than an A. So there's going to be situations where you've got a ship that you don't have the strike team for, or maybe you just are already using the strike team. You're in a territory fight and you've got 6 to 8 ships that you need to crew. He's definitely going to be on one of them. So definitely that high level of crit for the first 8 rounds is very strong. It can be countered a lot by some of the other ships these days, but I think it still has its place. Used to be the completely dominant PvP guy, now is kind of second level, but I think beyond that strike team area, you're still going to be using him. I think often with to me, on an Explorer with TOS Kirk and TOS Uhura is usually where I'm going to stick him. So kind of get your main Explorer, but I've still got other strong Explorers that are certainly useful in PvP, and you're probably going to put him on something like that. Alternatively, he could be a fill-in where you need hull breach, or you need to cause crits to trigger hull breach. Definitely is valuable in that capacity. Hugh is going in our S plus thing, and like 5 of 11, Hugh has possibly the claim of being the best, one of the best officers in the game. Certainly by far, and not even a question about it, is the strongest below deck officer in the game. So the fact that he causes crits below deck when none of the main hostile grinding things are going to be causing crits is just a massive, massive game changer. So it can also really adjust what the rest of your crew above deck actually looks like. So while PMC and S&W Pike with wingmen has often been the standard, having Hugh below deck really starts to help you make the argument for a Lorca up top, or somebody triggering hull breach up top, because you're going to have the crits provided by another source. And unlike other officers like Khan, which we'll get to in a moment, he doesn't need to ramp up in the same way. So usually crit officers have been, I'm going to start at 0 and I'm going to add like 4 or 5% per round over the duration of the fight, like Khan does. Hugh doesn't do that. It's just a chance to trigger. And once he triggers, it can actually become cumulative for each shot that you're doing. So he can eventually provide a really, really high crit rate very quickly. Just one round into the fight, he's already firing off crits like crazy. Whereas often something like a Khan on a hostile grinding ship, you're only going to fight 3-4 rounds against this hostile. He's never going to get to a point where you're critting like 75% of the time. So it's not as valuable. But with Hugh doing that completely below decks, with some decent stats on him, even at a fairly low tier, you can then look at things like a hull breach above deck, or just plain running your normal mitigation and safety crews. But you're just churning through these things a lot quicker. So he can really put down the opponent much, much faster from his below deck position. And there's nobody in the game, certainly no below deck officer, that comes anywhere near that. If you were to kind of put them in equivalent terms, where something like a Beckett is, I think at this level, level 20, increased weapon damage by 140%. Hugh is essentially increased weapon damage by like 6,000%. It's going to provide that crit that already does bonus damage. And if you then stack hull breach on top of that, it just gets crazy to the point that your crits are now hitting for 8-9 times what your normal shots do. He's just absolutely amazing. I hope that they've snuck him in sourcing here and there, but they're being pretty stingy with it. So if you're someone that kind of missed out on him as he was released, and if I recall when they released him, it was kind of a, would you like to buy stuff in this event store, or would you like to spend essentially everything you have on Hugh? And it may not have been apparent to people at the time, but the correct decision was essentially spend everything you have on Hugh and make sure that you get him. So I hope that sourcing does improve for him, but I think they realize they've got a super valuable guy there that everyone is going to want, and everyone's going to want to tier up. Kataka, or however you're supposed to pronounce that, is gonna, it's hard to put a strike team officer not in an S, but I'm gonna not put him in an S. The Explorer is definitely the worst one. Weyoun is kind of the strong one there, and we'll get to him much later. But Kataka is just not that powerful. He kind of enhances the weapon damage that you have, but not nearly fast enough, not nearly the strength that it should be. It's kind of in double-digit strength boosts, but to really feel something, it needs to be like hundreds, if not like 1,000%. And it's kind of one of the officers that you could potentially trade out of the situation if you didn't need the synergy with Weyoun there. So definitely not, possibly the weakest out of the strike team officers, and certainly the Explorer one is the weakest overall. Instructor Spock, I mean, is going to go in F. I don't know if there's any use for him even pretty early. I don't think he's part of that cadet crew thing. They didn't even call him cadet because he's, old and stuff. So he's going to be off to his own, and I think he falls in that useless category. Jadzia Dax, to me, goes into an A. So her sole use is going to be the Solar Armadas, whether it be the Dominion ones or the Borg ones. But her use in that category is an absolute cannon. So she can increase the base amount that you're doing. I think at the tier 3 that I've got her was 1,050%. And she also then reduces the defenses, or she increases your piercing, for the duration of that armada by a percentage of, I believe it's the health that you have. So just a super strong officer that she increases the raw damage to begin with, and she increases how much of that damage gets through mitigation. Also synergizes well with Bashir, who increases the crit rate of the ship. So usually what I've been using there is Jadzia, Bashir, and Lorca on the side, and they're just an absolute cannon. They just do so much damage output in it. And you used to be able to not do that very well because none of those officers provide defense, but you can actually now stick Tom Paris underneath, and he can provide damage or reduced damage to your ship, the mitigation from below decks, while they are just absolutely firing all weapons at top capacity. So Jadzia decks, pretty important one, but just for that niche, just for the solar armadas. But those are pretty important, and she's a big key to them. Javid or Javid or whatever, gonna go in that D category. He has, what's his ability? It's not engineer. It's one of them, innovator or something like that. Whatever he is, he's good for some of the early away teams. Maybe even use him a little bit later. Not like the best for it, but he's kind of one of those guys that's around. You're probably not going to have him on a ship, but he's there. Jayla is less useful these days than I think in the past. Jayla is really exclusively for the swarm and can increase some of the loot that you get based on her abilities. But with the swarm being less important now because of the freebooters, you don't really even have to kill them. It used to be just part of a daily that you kill them every day. Once you get to the point that you can do freebooters and you've unlocked the research where freebooters count as swarm, she becomes obviously less and less useful. The sourcing on her is also really, really, really bad. Again, one of the worst officer sourcing in the entire game. And I've only ended up with her because they gave like a pack where you could just unlock a full epic as part of like an anniversary or something a while back, like a year ago. So I got her from that. But yeah, just completely useless to me outside that concept. And now that you don't need to do swarm all the time, you only need to do it kind of once a week, then it's just not that important anymore, since you can just kill the freebooters anyway. So was really good for swarm, or still is really good for swarm, is good for bonus loot, but outside that context is no longer, to me, pushing into that AS category, is down to a B just because you don't need that stuff so much anymore. We've got Jean-Luc Picard into, he's almost like a B plus, but maybe an A. He's kind of like the Pike of Armadas, that you can use him with TNG synergy to then increase the impact that other officers have on their officer ability. His own actual contribution to it is not particularly good. I think he's got like a plus 5% damage to armadas or something like kind of stupid. But you just need him to be able to enhance the officer ability of other people. So again, a Jean-Luc Picard, Beverly, Gala sort of crew can work out well, or mixing her in with something, or mixing him in with something like Riker or something like that can help out, but not super powerful anymore. And I think as they add more Armada officers, becomes less important, but I think at this point is still kind of in that A category of someone that you can use. It's just a matter, again, with Jean-Luc Picard, it's a matter of getting him. And I think they've now added him to the transport pattern so you can. So it may be something that's more accessible to someone earlier on, but yeah, just not quite that top tier of Armada, but like that second tier of Armada stuff or niche things. Joachim or Joachim or whatever. Probably D category here as well. Useful for a couple of the away team things. Okay as a synergy for this fella, but not someone that's crucial. And there's other alternatives for that synergy anyway. So either way, him you're going to use for Joaquin for the data in particular, so you're going to use them on a Botany Bay, and that's just about it. Pretty much is always going to be the captain of that and going to enhance your mining, and that's about it for it. So I'll stick him in a B with the rest of the other miners, but given that he's more limited, maybe he's actually more of a C sort of thing, but you do need a fair bit of data, so we'll put him there and say he's good for his niche use. Julian Bashir, less important to me than Jadzia Dax, can be a good synergy for that, but given that he increases the crit chance that you have, but then it's solid. It doesn't increase during the fight. So it's, again, good for those early few rounds, in which case then one that increases would actually be better. But for something like the Borg spheres, those fights are only 2-3 rounds anyway, most of the time. So that's kind of where he's going to have his niche, is helping Judzi out, but he's less important than the other parts of that. So I'll put him in a B instead. Kang here is going to fill the role here again of being away team, very helpful for Klingons, and also plays into that triumvirate system of the battle triangle against certain mission hostiles, maybe certain Q trials ones, where he's going to help out specifically against interceptors. But again, that's used to be very powerful, used to be very useful, not quite as much anymore. So I think he's down to a B. Janeway here is a debatable one. People seem to love her. I don't as much. The way that her ability of increasing shield mitigation works is basically that you take hits, and then the next hits that you take go 100% to your shields, but you have to take the hits in the first place to trigger it. And depending what you're fighting, if you're fighting, say, faction surveys in order to increase rep, they only fire once per round anyway until you get to very high levels. So it doesn't really help with those. It helps against some of the other ships, and it helps against certain key things, but it's very dependent on the firing pattern of what you're fighting, on whether she's actually really helpful or not. I'm still going to put her in an A, but I haven't found it the best yet. I think she could be really good on the Voyager itself, and maybe it's just the fact that I kind of don't need that because I've got ships that can do that are much stronger, basically. But I think maybe if you're in like the 40s and Voyager can reach places your main ships can't, her being able to be helpful defending there may help out. But and then she's got some role in the Armada side as well, with some synergy with Chakotay. But I'm not 100% sold yet just on how it works. But I think there are definitely some niche uses where if you're going to be fighting an enemy that shoots many times per round, then she's going to be able to take the first shot and then absorb the rest into the shield. And as long as you're then not running out of the shield during that fight, that's the idea, that she's minimizing hull damage that you're actually taking by only taking one shot per round instead of the rest. Obviously, when she's got full synergy. So there's definitely a use there. I haven't totally found it, but I kind of am trusting other people that seem to be delighted by her, and trust that it's at least an A, and I'll see if I can kind of find those uses myself later. I find for the Voyager and its main purpose of killing the DQ or Dairy Queen ships or whatever, that because you want to get the skulls and eyes and stuff like that from them, then I'm not using any ship for... I'm using ships that are looking for more loot. So I'm using 5. I'm using things that increase the loot that I get from them instead of worrying about survivability and damage and things like that. So to me, that's where I'd gear away from it, but I know that there can be other uses. So I'll still stick her in an A. For Katie, I'm going to put down into a D here as well. And Kabich or whatever is also probably going to be stuck in a D. Again, early mining officer, but not something that's important. Keenzer, he seems to have a special place in the game, but he doesn't really have much use. He's an engineering trait officer for away teams. He's a good one. He can provide defense stats fairly well, but not really one of the best. Basically, he's never going to leave the starbase ever. Aside from his little away team mission. So I think he's a D, despite the fact that for some reason he's like the special one that you unlock in weekly chests and things like that. He's just never really fulfilled like something special about him, but he's a recognizable, cool guy. Kurla, I'm going to put in C for having a weird niche use. Kurla is one of the officers that you'd use on something like a sarcophagus mixed with Curon and Harrison. So there's a crew combo that you can do. Curon as captain, Kurla and Harrison on the wings. That basically is designed to make your sarcophagus kill any opponent in the first round or two of combat by enhancing and recharging your kinetic weapons, and then Harrison ignoring their shields. The idea being that you basically just fire everything as strong as possible, and hopefully you kill them basically while taking no damage. That's the play. That's not as useful anymore these days either, but it is kind of still a game plan that exists for territory, but it's very niche. And other than that, maybe you're going to use him on away teams now and then, something like that, as he is a decent stat officer. But beyond that, he's certainly going no higher than a C, and it's kind of gimmicky when you would use the guy. Khan, I'm still... See, he's less valuable than he was, but I think he's still in the S tier. And the reason why, he's definitely still part of one of the strongest Armada combos that you're going to do, which is 5-6 Con. He's going to increase the crit rates that you get over time. And he also has pretty extreme value below decks as well. His overall stats are very high, so you're going to use him a lot in the below deck as well. Almost as good as a Grush in getting your stats up and maxing out those bars so that you can start using the below deck officers down there as well. So I think Khan is still in the S. He's pretty versatile. He used to have a bigger role in PvP, not so much anymore. However, does probably on kind of your second, third ships beyond your strike team is probably still going to show up there. So, but because of his importance in something like Armadas, I think he still has to be there. Particularly if you're running solo Armadas, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to have a crew that doesn't have him in one of the three of them. And yeah, if you're crewing 8 ships for PvP, he's obviously on one of those at the very least. So I don't know. It feels weird as I'm talking about it, it sounds more like he's an A and maybe formerly an S. But now that you can replace him a little bit, it's not as strong of an argument. You can put on other people that either start with a better crit rate or that ramp up potentially faster. A very high level Cisco could potentially be higher depending on the firing pattern of what you're going for. But yeah, Khan's debatable. He'd almost be an A+, but yeah, let's stick him in an S anyway. He's still a mainstay, and he's still there. Kira is PvP only, really, but is a very strong one. So what she does is reduces the crit chance of your opponent as a below-deck officer, and is really the only person that does that. So not the damage, but the chance. A lot of things reduce the damage, but she reduces it by 15%, I think, at the first tier, and then up from there. Most ships, if they don't have a critical enhancement on them, like more damage or more of a chance in the crew, are probably going to be around 20 to 22%, depending on your level and your level of research. So her lowering that by 15% right out of the gate drastically reduces the odds of them hitting you with a crit in the first place. So you're often going to use her on something like against an explorer, against a battleship, where neither of those strike teams actually improve the critical hit chance. Using her against a interceptor is kind of meaningless because Garrick is going to overpower that so quickly that it doesn't really matter. However, it could stall it out in like the first round and help you survive a tiny bit. But basically strongest on something like an explorer where you want a like long, low damage fight, explorer versus explorer, something like that. So she's definitely a good one. Not the very best of below decks, but certainly a strong PvP below deck officer. Kirk here, I'm going to put into the A category because he is replaceable. There's certainly other things that provide morale, but the classic Kirk Spock synergy on most ships is really good. And where I find he plays the absolute best is on a Stella. So if you're doing Stellar Armadas, it's still hard, despite all the things that they've added, it's hard to find a better combination than Kirk Spock Khan on this. So again, maybe justifying why Khan's up here. But Kirk Spock Khan against Eclipse things, your shields are going to recharge faster than it can do any damage to you. Your shields are never going to deplete. You've got a nice stable crew. And now particularly that you can put Tom Paris below deck to improve your mitigation. You can have max mitigation, max shield up the entire thing, eventually ramp your crits up to 100% and you're just cruising. So Kirk is super good there. Also one of the officers that you can get very, very early, even as a low level player. You're going to unlock Kirk in your like low 20s, if not before that. Basically, as soon as you can start opening those Federation faction packs of officers, he's going to come out, Spock's going to come out, and you're going to have a very stable thing. They're also really good at dealing with early mission bosses where PMC doesn't help you and you need something else. This is going to be one of your only crews. And even early PvP is actually very helpful. When you don't have anything fancy yet, a Kirk, Spock, and Khan is definitely going to kill most of the low 20s people that you've got, provided they haven't gone and bought anything much fancier than that. So it's really good across the board lower, and it does have survivability even in like mid 50s. I'm still using them for the Stellar Armadas. Claw here is really useful for speed. It's only an impulse speed officer, but with stuff like the Rialta races being a thing, and there's just cases where you're going to want to go around and kill things as quick as possible. So Claw is one of the best impulse speed increasers in the game. I consider that still kind of niche, so I'm going to say a B, but definitely is valuable there. Kamal is going to fall into our useless category down here, as I can't remember ever really using for anything, and I don't even think he's the best synergy officer for anything either. Koth may actually suffer the same fate of being useless, and I don't think I ever use them on away teams or anything like that either. Crass is going in the B to me. PvP and base defense officer. So Kraz's main claim to fame is that he nullifies the captain's ability of the thing that you're fighting against. And if you put him with full synergy, he can lower that ability by quite a bit. So you end up seeing him used actually in base defense structures a lot by taking away the captain's ability of the ship trying to attack you. So can really help in nullifying stuff like ROM on your base side and just kind of take away the advantage that they have. He used to be a little more useful in actual ship-to-ship PvP, but because of the way that they made the strike teams work, he doesn't work as well against them. There's like a stipulation of at the start of combat, this does this, and he doesn't seem to impact that as much, which kind of nullifies him a bit. He's also got some good away team stuff for the Klingons and can be useful there as well, but not quite an A, but has that niche use as the base defense guy and stuff. Krell here, probably in the D category. You're going to use him on away teams, and that's just about it. And kind of similar for Kumak here as well. Decent enough stat officer early game, but you're really going to use for away teams. Curon is going to go in both the impulse speed, and he has that niche use on the Sarko in that he helps with the kinetic weapons, but mostly just going to be there for the impulse speed boost, but is definitely good when he does that. Leslie, we're going to stick in the same category as Darwin and the other XP officers, perhaps a little bit more useful just because of the amount of time that you're going to be spending leveling up battleships compared to other things, because of the Stella scrap and loop cycle, you're very frequently going to be wanting to level up your Stellas, and you're going to be farming with your Stellas to get codes. So he's pretty good at enhancing that. You can just run PM Leslie, and usually, within a couple runs, your Stella can go from like 0 to maxed. And you can go ahead and scrap it again. So just given the time pressure there, he's a lot potentially more useful than the others, but still probably in that C range. Linkasa, I'm going to say, is an F. Again, no real use there. Livis, maybe some stats, maybe some away team, but other than that, not really useful. Lenar also going to go into the F category. And then Lorca is going to make his way all the way up to the S. So Lorca is great at triggering hull breach, and can be used as a wing officer. So something that I've been using a lot more now is the 5 Gallinar Lorca combination. And what that basically does, like for rep grinding. So 5 is giving you all the defense that you need. Gallinar is providing extra faction on top of it and giving synergy to 5 to give that extra defense. Lorca is then causing hull breach to trigger most of the time. Hugh is triggering the crits from below deck, and that combination altogether is creating massive, massive damage. So even things that are fairly high level are dying in a round or two of combat, and really reducing the amount of damage that I'm taking just because they're putting out so much damage on the front end. And that used to not be possible. You'd have to stick it with, there was nobody that could get you the same crit level that Hugh was getting you below deck. So sticking on someone like Lorca and wanting the crits to ramp up, given that the fights are so short, it was just never getting there. You were never getting above like a 10, 20% crit rate above what you flat get anyway, like 22%. So you were never getting to the point that most things were crits. Now you're getting to the point that like 75, 80% of your shots are going to be critical hits, and you're getting the hull breach on them. It's just massive damage. Lorca can also be used in PvP as a fill-in for Ducat. So if you don't have Ducat, but you've got the other 2 wingmen, you can stick Lorca there in the middle. Also works, as I discussed earlier, with Captain Tilly and the Emperor to trigger that. And again, just a really, really good officer overall. Also really good in armadas, usually is on my like power damage ship. I mentioned the Jadzia, Bashir, and Lorca. Just huge, huge damage output coming out of it. And again, if you're the small ship, and it rarely talked about, because people tend to talk about like what's the best combo for an armada. But if you're a small ship out there and you're bringing, like, you're the 4th or 5th in your armada, bring Gala, Lorca, and Nero or something. Get some of these effects on the armada, and then the hull breach applies to everyone. It's assigned to the target. So then when someone else hits a crit, they get the advantage of your hull breach. The Gala reduces the crits for everybody. The burning goes directly on the target. So having that sort of thing mixed in when you're not the power puncher, you can be helping your team out by a whole lot by including these things on it, because now you're helping increase the damage of whoever the biggest person is, or really everyone, but you're now contributing to that damage and increasing it by 70% total or something by giving them the hull breach on top of it. So yeah, just a very, very strong officer. Definitely a solid S tier there, and a lot of versatility in other areas. Lursa here, weird one. I'm going to say basically useless in this. I don't think I've ever had her on an away team or ever had her on a ship. And is one of these ones that for some reason, there's also no sourcing. I don't know where you really get her, but it's a slow tech for me to still have an uncommon officer that's level 10 at this point. But yeah, just doesn't appear to be a useful one. Makinen, I'm going to stick in the C category again, kind of a specialty sort of thing, and not not really that overall important. And again, really no sourcing there anyway. Mara is going to go with a bunch of the other folks in the D of the rare Ds that have no particular purpose, but occasionally is going to be something you send away on an away mission, something like that. Marcus is going to be going in the A category. So out of the Trinity officers, the Charvanek, Marcus, and Kang, Marcus definitely has the highest value outside of that. So Marcus is actually a potential player on the strike team side. So there are combinations you can do where you use Wei-Yun as a captain and put Marcus as one of the wingmen, and you're kind of rolling the dice on whether or not Wei-Yun triggers. But Marcus can end up giving you better capabilities, particularly against other explorers, that can end up winning the fight. So if you find that you're losing PvP using strike team versus strike team, explorer versus explorer, swapping out one of the wingmen for Marcus can actually give you the advantage in that by basically lowering the amount of damage that they're going to do and giving you the upper hand. So he's got to play there. He's also pretty good in a lot of the yellow mission hostiles to give you that, again, extra suppression of their damage. And he also plays in well with some of the other synergies like Yuki that can, again, help out in some niche PvP or some niche mission hostile or Q trial type situations when you want to either be trying to drain shields or just make the fight last longer. He can be helpful there. So definitely out of the three is the strongest one, but not quite into the S tier, but I think still a strong A. Also really good below deck officer just for stats as well. A little bit better than I think the other two do at the same levels in terms of what the distribution is. Marla, I think, is also going in the D category of the rare officer that is not particularly useful, but, is there. Been around for a while and not that great. Martok has a few more specific away team abilities that can make him a C to help with the Klingon stuff, and it also has some niche PvP potential. That maybe makes him a C, but it's kind of a weak C. He probably should have been a better guy than he is. The same with Gowron, really, but it just isn't quite there. Mavery, despite being like rare and it takes a while to get him because he's such a high syndicate level and all this stuff, it's not that amazing. He's a good guy. He gives you kind of the, mining and cargo enhancement stuff, which is great, but it's not earth-shattering. There's still, to me, in that same level range as a lot of the other mining officers. So many people don't have them. You do need to be quite high along the syndicate thing, which really just is, have you played for a long time and has you kept up with your Mantis stuff. But helpful, not earth-shattering, but when you're running, 4 or 5 mining ships, he's definitely going to be on one of them, and he's probably potentially even going to be on your best one, but is basically in the same route as everybody else. Maveng is useless, which is a shame. He's a good character on Strange New Worlds, but he's useless. Just no potential use, no away team use. He's never left the station in the entirety of his career. Michael Burnham is another one of these ones that's kind of, to me, on the level of Data, where has no use and is sourced through away teams, is a little easier to get than Data through the away teams, but is just a rare officer or an epic officer, but is made scarce for no apparent reason and has no real use for the officer. So I don't know what the original conception there was, but to me, just kind of close to useless, but maybe a user on an away team, maybe a user for stats, something like that. Miles O'Brien is probably going on an S tier. The extra shots make him one of the best Armada officers. You're always going to have him partnered with Cisco. It's a chance thing as well, which I wish it wasn't. I wish it was flat like Chakotay is, but is certainly one of the best officers out there. Just running the DS9 crew, is an S tier Armada officer. Although, as I'm saying it, maybe, yeah, I'll leave it S. I'll put some of the others lower, but yeah, I think you've got to have all three of the DS9s in S since they're essentially inseparable in this. Mirik is going down in D tier as well, very similar to some of the other kind of useless rares. Mitchell, maybe a step up. His away team abilities for tactical fit into a couple of the more important away teams, and you can use him as a stat officer a little bit too, although he tends to be, to me, more of an away team stat officer to increase kind of the percentage that you get, as well as going on the tactical missions. Moreau is definitely going in the S tier. She is kind of the main thing giving you, even though she doesn't technically give mitigation, she lowers the piercing of your opponent to the point that it's not possible to not have max mitigation once you've got her leveled up enough. So if she, I think it's tier 3 or higher, if she's tier 3 or higher, then coupled with Pike, she will always make your mitigation the maximum 71.2% against any hostile, no matter what ship you're in, because what she effectively does is lowers the enemy's piercing to 0. It will take her value, multiply it by that Pike bonus, and effectively make them 0. So no matter what stats you have, it is enough to completely mitigate that out. That is a hyper powerful ability, and it just means that you do not have to worry about mitigation once you get to that point. Before that, there are other solutions. Tom Paris can help you with mitigation for early players with PMC, probably to your, I don't know what level you get her to, tier 3, depending how lucky you are, probably your low to mid 30s, something like that. But yeah, she's super powerful and is going to be a staple on your hostile grinding stuff all the way to level 52, basically. And even after that, they still work on the Q's trials now. There's no explicit level given to the Q's trials enemies, so you can still use PMC against them, and it will take away their piercing as well, or their penetration stuff. Emerald is kind of low tier away team warrior ability, so you can use from the beginning of the game all the way through, but isn't anything special. Mud is going to have a niche ability, which is fighting something like the capital ship or capital system traders. There's a Mud Bev Con combination that you can use that constantly regenerates your shield. So as you lose them, he regenerates or she regenerates them. Beverly does, and Mud increases the damage that you do, which you can have happen in a cycle that massively increases the damage that you're doing to your opponent. But it's a very niche case that you're going to use that. So I'm going to put him in, well, I put some of the other niche ones in a B. If you're in that level range that's important to you, which is probably from the high 30s to the low 40s, then I think he's really important. I used him a lot in that period of time. However, if you're outside that and there isn't a very specific target that you're trying to fight, then not as useful. But it's certainly very useful in that niche, so I'll give him some credit for that. Navi is a bit of an away team officer as well, and not much else. Some synergy on speed crews, but that's about it. You don't get much credit for that. Neelix is really valuable for one thing, which is that he's going to improve the efficiency of the juice that you need to run Voyager abilities. So useless in terms of fighting or anything like that, but pretty much has to be on the bridge. If you're going out to use the Voyager detection ability, then you want him on the bridge. There's pretty much going to be no reason that you're not going to have him on the bridge. So if you can't kill those things without him, then go down a level or something, because he's going to help out with that a lot more. And yeah, Really a one-trick pony, and really kind of a, to be honest, that's just a manipulative one by Scopely. They made it so that you need him to be able to open the full amount of chests using the Herogen, not the Herogen skulls, but the eyes, whatever they call the 8472 eyes. You really can't max that out every time unless you have him, even using max loot officers and stuff. So they're just kind of saying, like, we've created a problem. Here's Neelix. He's the solution to that problem that we specifically created so that we can sell you Neelix. Obviously, you can see I haven't unlocked him yet. I think I will by the end of the arc. But yeah, that's all it is. You do need him, but it's that one specific purpose, and he's useless otherwise. So in a lot of ways, very true to the show itself. Nero, I'm going to put in the A tier as well here, because I think for me, because I've got him maxed, his burning ability is more consistent than Giorgio's is. So I tend to use him more. And again, because he's higher level, he's almost always on the below decks of one of my ships. But I use him a lot for the hostile grinding in Actian space to do those, and I find that he kills them. He triggers burning more consistently, so he is killing them in about 3 or 4 rounds less than Giorgio tends to take. It's about 16 versus 20 usually when I do it. So I find he's a little better, and he is a better below deck officer. He's also a more important away team officer. He is key to the away team tokens, or whatever they're called, things. So there's why am I forgetting the name? Diplomacy something. There's the one where the top level is like 200 of the away team shuttles and like 7,000 if you crit it. Him, Kirk, and Jayla can be used all together to crit that mission like over 80% of the time if you max out their abilities. So I find them super useful for that, and that's definitely going to be useful to get you blueprints and everything throughout the game, is to be constantly critting that mission when it comes up. So you want to be doing that. So I do think he is the better officer overall, and obviously way, way, way easier to source. You can source him through the Romulan packs in the really early game. He also has some potential early game PvP usage. Burning crews and stuff like that are a little bit valuable in early game. Later on, not so much, but you can use them for that sort of thing early on. Next Gen Crusher, I think, falls in the same category as the Cadets. And I'm going by memory here. I think it was Data that's on the outs. It was Crusher, LaForge, and Troy, I think, that end up making up the good triumvirate. And Riker also kind of useless. Again, only early game crews. And you're going to stop using that hopefully by like 20 or something like that. But they are still there, or they're an alternative crew for another ship or something like that. Odo here is going to go into the S category as well. He is going to flat out increase the critical damage that you do on crits. So again, in the crit focused crews, whether it's PvP like the Interceptor Strike crew, you want him below decks, or if you're running a Hue crew that is focused on crits, so like I mentioned, 5 something Lorca, depending on what you're fighting, say 5 Galinar Lorca, Hue below decks. You also want Odo below deck and Mariner below deck to just pump out as much damage as you possibly can. He just gives that flat increase, which is additive on to the crit damage that you're doing. So I think he's super powerful. Scopely's clearly identified that he's quite powerful, and they've made the sourcing for him pretty bad as well. He's another one that, like, when they offered him, you had to give up a lot to get him if you wanted to unlock him, and then they made him pretty slow to get ever since then as well. But he's definitely worth it. Luckily, he does. I think he starts at 20%, and then it only goes up by 5% from there. So even tier 1 of him is valuable, and then it gets better, but that tier 1 is kind of the biggest hit. So he's definitely a good one. Origins Burnham, I think is in the useless category. I can't think of any real away team mission use there or anything that you'd use her for. Origin Saru and Origin Stamets are going in the same sort of useless category. I feel like the Origins thing, like just in general, was some of the least useful things overall. In the entire, like, of any arc, really. There's not much that came out of that one. Otto here is going to potentially go in the D category. There is some use for him in away teams. There is some use in synergies or something, but overall, you're not really going to use him. Pan, however, is going to go in the not your best impulse officer, but kind of your second best. So Claw, I think, works out to be the best. Pan is the alternative to that. They're very close. They're within like 5% of your impulse speed, but it just does take second place. And how often do you really need to? So have to mark them down a little bit, but Pan is there. And again, you'll use them on some away teams now and then. Paul Stamets is actually fairly decent for the single use, which is that he improves the efficiency of your disco juice. So there's a period of the game where, unfortunately, your miners are not going to be able to get to where they need to get to in deep space for you to mine what you need, and you're going to end up using a lot of the disco to get them to and from those locations, and he's going to help with the efficiency of that because you are going to run out when you're kind of in that pocket of time that you can't get to the locations you really want to with the miners that you've got. So he's helpful there. Obviously, Disco also useful in PvP, escaping Mantis stings or just getting places faster, making it to armadas in time, whatever. Anytime you're using the Disco, that's what he's for. That's good enough to me to earn a C, but, there's not much use beyond that. Pick Picard. I don't like these guys. I know what they're for, but they don't really play out well. I gotta say, Pick Picard's probably a C to me. I think is meant to be an alternative to Wei Yun if you don't have them, which a lot of people still don't. Like other strike teams are hard to get, but I just feel there's better replacements, particularly when it comes to the Explorer side, that make Picard not great. And it's got the bonus on them that they do extra damage to Explorers. So you're probably going to use him on an Explorer because he's morale. So you're going to be looking to use him in Explorer versus Explorer fights, which certainly happen a lot. A lot of people have Enterprises. A lot of people have Corvuses in particular. So that happens a lot, but the bonus isn't that high. 500% for tier 1 on paper sounds like a high number, 500%. It really equates out to like 14, 15%, depending. It all depends on the base damage of your ship, but it's not nearly as high as you think it is. In later tiers, it does climb all the way to 3,000. However, they've been really stingy with these officers so far, and there's no long-term sourcing for them. So I don't really know anyone that has them at a high tier or anything. There's no way to get them. And until it's at that point, really, they wouldn't be super valuable. And if you're the type of person that like threw a bunch of money at it, which I don't even know if you could for them, you probably have the strike team anyway, which is better. So I'm just not sure what the niche there is. I think you're better off with like a TOS Kirk replacement or something instead of using the Pick Picard. Pick Beverly it sounded like it was going to be a good idea until they came out with other officers that did the exact same thing better. So Pick Beverly Crusher specifically increases the amount of loot that you get for broken ship parts, which is good because you're going to find out that in your 4-star, in your 5-star, you're going to need a lot of these broken ship parts. The thing is, in the very next arc, they came out with the Doctor that does the same thing for all loot, and other officers like 5 of 11 already increase all loot more than that. So the fact that they restricted her to a niche thing, if you've got the extra spot, sure, you can throw her on, but it's only if you've kind of got the extra spot and you've already maxed your stats, you've already used your other officers, she's not going to help that much. So somewhat useful, but just there's other officers that do literally the exact same thing better, and even another officer that does the exact same thing better below decks. So there's just when would you use her is kind of the thing. Riker and Worf kind of in the same boat, but I think maybe a little better than Picard. So I think Riker and Worf maybe a tier up simply because there's not as many good replacements for them that make a different like fully functioning crew. So you could put in Worf where you're missing a Ducat. You could put in Riker where you're missing Lon, Strike Team Lon, and kind of get something out of them. But yeah, it's just not the best. It's still not enough to move them into an A tier. They're definitely plan B, whereas I feel like Picard is literally plan C, that you wouldn't use them unless you had to, unless it was a very niche situation where you knew you're fighting an Explorer, you knew this is the exact setup. So I think he's just a little bit worse. Pike is going into the S+. That should be fairly clear, I think, to everyone. He makes the PMC thing work. I mean, you obviously need all three to make him work, although Chen and Talon can be swapped out just depending on the situation, and Moreau gives him the synergy. But it's Pike that really kind of is the center here. He makes it work. He's also a really good stat officer for when you're not using him for killing hostiles. He works all the way up to level 51, basically. And now with the Q trials not having a level specific thing on them, he works for those as well. So Pike is really the guy for the majority of the game, for the majority of people, for the majority of targets that they're going to be fighting. So I think denying that he's an S+ doesn't make sense. He's definitely a top guy. And if there's one thing that, like, from the very beginning of the game, if you got a brand new player and were to say, I'm going to give you 300 shards of any officer you want, which one do you want? Then I think Pike is potentially the answer to that, as getting him up makes sense. Moreau potentially because you need to get her to tier 3 to fully max. But yeah, basically he's the guy that you want to unlock, and it can often take people time to get him fully unlocked since you need that initial 100. And it's such a game changer once you have him. It just makes everything work, and people start killing 3-4 times more efficiently. Pawn here is probably going to go into the same category as his wingman. Again, Strike Team Explorer, not very strong, weakest of the strike teams, and he is kind of interchangeable out of there as well. He at least does the thing of helping suppress crit damage from your opponent, whereas Ikaruka doesn't, is more of an enhancer for you. So Pawn is a little more valuable there. If you're going to swap one out, then it's usually Ikaruka that you drop. But I've seen a lot of people running a Weiyun Pawn Marcus crew, and then you kind of take a chance on Weiyun triggering in the first round, but you then get more mitigation or extra defense out of that. Pawn still works, and so on. So I've seen people kind of do it that way. So he's a little better, but not to me enough to put him in the S, because it's situational, and it also doesn't... he can become redundant essentially with Kira, because Kira lowers the crit chance of your opponent, and Pawn lowers the crit chance. That if you're trying to suppress, say, a battleship's crits or another explorer's crits, and they don't have a crit enhancing officer on those ships, which they usually won't because Strike Team doesn't do that, then either one of them will zero it out, and you don't need both of them. So if you put Kira below deck and she's tiered up at all, she's going to completely remove that battleship's chance to crit against you, and you didn't need Pawn to do it in the first place. So there's a trade-off there. It does help a little if you're trying to smother an interceptor, but yeah, it's it's just not crucial. So out of the strike teams, they're definitely the worst. They're still A's because they are still what they are, and they provide Wayoon synergy, but they're just not that great. Here we've got another, I'm going to call straight up useless officer. Really no away team application there either. We've got Quark, which I'm putting in the B. Pretty much all my mainline minors are there, and Quark's good, but there's nothing, again, super ridiculously special about it or anything. Barclay helping with the protected cargo is nice, but I'm still going to put in the same sort of B category. The fact that it's below deck, essentially, free help, great. But the bonus isn't that much, really. And yeah, it's just a bit lackluster. It's kind of he's there, but is it that important? Not really. There's so many other bonuses to protected cargo anyway. It doesn't really doesn't make a giant difference. Rima is going to go into the away team semi-useless category. Rom, a lot of people love Rom, and he was the best base cracking officer and potentially still is. However, because of the complicated base setups that people can now do, ROM can't really get through that. And the ability is often kind of canceled out. So there's some argument to be made now that the strike teams themselves are simply better against the base anyway. So depending on the level that you're at, the ships that you're using, what you're facing, I don't think he's as important as he used to be. And he's kind of only got that one use, that you're only going to pull him out to attack a base. And in something where you're in a real fighting situation like incursions or something, I'd kind of rather have a PvP crew on my ship anyway and use that for bases, because someone might hit my ship while I'm trying to do it too. But I don't know. I think some people are going to think that it's blasphemy to say that he's in a B, but I think he's in a B now. I don't think that he's as important as he was at the beginning, where his abilities actually fully worked. Now you generally are going to hit a base without your abilities really working anyway, and you're just going to have to survive through it. And I don't know that Rom is the best. I could be convinced others with some battle logs or something, but I don't personally use them anymore. And I find, just at least anecdotally, I find that just using strike teams worked better than he did, just because of the way that things trigger. Romud is going in the D category of useless, but sometimes on away teams, down to completely useless. Sam Rutherford is going to go in the C category here. So he's better than the Badgian Boimler, but because he affects shield HP, unless you're fighting something that specifically will completely drain your shield, is not useful. So if you're fighting hostiles, they're not going to drain your shield, so having extra shields doesn't really help, whereas the 10D version of having extra hull does help, because you're going to survive that extra fight or two, but shields doesn't. So potentially useful in like a niche Armada situation, maybe some PvP situations, but only if you've already stacked everyone else on there that you can. So if you've got like 5 slots, he might be like your 5th below deck officer, but never before that. If you're really struggling for those extra, those extra shield hit points, then you've already loaded up your hull ones and your damage and other things. So a C, but not quite a D, but definitely not great. Saru, I don't even know if I use him for away teams. I guess for stats, you may. I think his defense is high, and that's about it. Scotty, occasional away team guy, somehow appears to be the only version of Scotty that doesn't help you warp places. Sela, I think was meant to have some use at some point, but just doesn't have any use anywhere for anything, which is kind of weird. I guess, again, away teams, maybe some niche stuff. Sesha, I think, is in the 0 out category. No use there. 7 of 9 is S tier to me. PvP only, obviously. Well, actually, not only. She does have Armada abilities as well. I haven't used that yet. But for PvP in particular, it's just 7 of 9 increases your damage by this percentage. And your real damage, not your base damage, not your pre-additions damage, takes the total damage that you do, both normal and isolytic, and simply enhances it by that number. And there's basically nothing else like that in the game. It's almost like she's a permanent mini crit, that it just takes the total and enhances it. And yeah, I think that's going to be super, super, super powerful. Just outright increase of like 12% to the power of your ship is pretty rare that exists. And then every other upgrade you get, she'll just keep adding to that amount. So I think this is certainly compared to Beckett, like in terms of weapon damage versus a PvP person, is going to be way, way better. Obviously doesn't work against PvE stuff. However, she does have Armada abilities that look decent as well. So I think this is definitely going to be an S tier officer. I don't know whether people have fully registered that yet, and the sourcing for her this month has been super expensive. They're using the milestones again. Top milestone is like crazy high, at least for my level. So curious if other people found that too, but I think so. But yeah, I expect that she's going to be one that after this month, it's going to be very hard to get additional shards of her. We'll see if that's true, but I kind of get that sense she's not in the other Voyager sourcing through the rare formation armadas. So I don't know what the sourcing will be of her, but if you can this month, I would get as much as you possibly can, because I think she's going to be a PvP mainstay forever. I can't imagine her ever losing value on that, because it's just a flat increase no matter what else is applied to it. Severus, I think, is going to go into the completely useless category, and then we are back to yeah, I guess I'll say yes. One of the best Armada officers out there. So 6 of 11 does lowers or increases your penetration by a percentage of your attack, synergizes with 5 of 11, and again, that 5/6 con crew is super, super powerful. Can be used on solo armadas and group armadas, and is just really, really strong for that purpose. But outside of the armadas, obviously doesn't really have as much of a role, but is really it probably is the best Armada wingman officer in terms of getting that penetration through. So, and I think a lot of people undervalue the penetration point of it, that they look for more damage and more shots. But having this, particularly on longer fights, if the more rounds it is, the more that 6 of 11 is going to stack. So when you're doing something like the Dominion solo ones, they can often last like 10, 15, 20 rounds, depending on the level you're doing. And each time he's cutting into that, and you're getting more and more penetration through. So it's going direct to the hull instead of being absorbed by the mitigation. So, which is very, very crucial. So having them and having Jadzia on another ship, basically so much of the damage that you're getting through is going there, and then changing Kira on the third one is then lowering the defense for everybody, again increasing it even more. So you just start to bypass the mitigation more and more. That's a super, super valuable one. You can use transporter patterns to level him up as well, because it does get a bit higher as you go up. Chev, despite being a cool looking dude, useless. S&W Hemmer is now getting into the, I think he's probably an S, just because your main target is often going to be surveys. If you're trying to grind your faction rep up, you're going to be killing survey ships to do that. That's what he gives the mitigation against, and it can be used on any ship against them. He synergizes with S&W Pike, so I think that's kind of the one to go for. S&W Lawn is going to increase your cargo space. Again, pretty valuable there, but is kind of falling in that mining category as well, but is a below deck officer for it. And I think she's definitely a B, but I wouldn't put her. It's kind of you stick her on a miner and you kind of forget her. You maybe use her for a niche thing or two, but that's about it. S&W Ortegas, I'm going to put these three in the A, and they're basically all the same thing, just depending on what your ship type is. So for Battleship, Explorer, and Interceptor, the only difference, I guess, is that you're going to be using some of them more than others. So for fighting for your Vidar or Vidar Talios, the Uhura may be a bit better because, of course, it's an interceptor fighting against battleships. Your Mantis, you could potentially use her on, although if you've got the ability to use Tal burning crews, then you often don't even use your Mantis to fight Actians. You're going to use another ship with a large hull capacity. I'm now using the Vidar Telios most of the time because I can stick, 5 million things on it. So that's great. And then Spock for specialty ships would usually be like on a Franklin. But then depending what your main combat ship is, it's obviously whichever one of these three you use, and that's the one that you're using. So I think all pretty equal. It just depends on you personally, which, what your hostile grinding ships are. S&W Pike, I'm going to put in the S+, and because very similar to the original Pike, he is the one really driving the whole thing. He is going to increase your mitigation against the opponent, so you're going to absorb more into the shields. It's almost like a slightly lighter version of Janeway, that you're going to take more to the shields instead of getting it to the hull. And I kind of found really over the long run outperforms Janeway, but your mileage may vary depending on your ships and so on. And then his officer ability is going to be cutting through the shield mitigation of your opponent as well, and that's based on his tier. So the higher tier that you can get him to, the more he's going to ignore the mitigation of your opponent, the shield mitigation, not the normal mitigation. So you can get that down, I think, at max tier to 35%. And so a lot more, again, of your original shot is going through the hull. Something I've been playing with lately is the idea of a Pike Moreau S&W Pike to more than double the amount of shield mitigation reduction that is happening against the opponent, so that you can basically get it so that from round one, you're simply bypassing their shields almost entirely and just getting the damage directly onto their hull. So that seems to work in certain situations. I've used it against a couple of the Q trials people where they had a massive shield or like shield regeneration happening each round, and that's been okay at cutting through there. So yeah, he's definitely got a niche use, even as a wingman, which I haven't seen many people using him as. But you can actually use an S&W Pike 5 Lorca to cut through shields more because it's the officer's ability, then have your defense, and then have your hull breach as well. And again, you're just kind of piling it onto their hull a lot more and more there instead of using the normal S&W crew. S&W Una is really just impulse speed. Again, the game Scopely seems to think that she's one of the most valuable officers in the world. I don't know why. I don't know what, it obviously makes hostile grinding a little easier just in terms of time, but, isn't helping you in combat really. So I don't see the big deal there. I'm going to tend to put her in a C with just kind of the other impulse. You could maybe say she's the top other wingman for impulse, but I don't know. I don't find it super, super valuable. And usually, if I'm doing something, there's a better person to have on that side, that while it may not increase my impulse speed, it's increasing my loot, or it's increasing something a little bit better. So I don't know that she's the best way to go. Spock here, am going to put in the A category. Like I talked about earlier, the Kirk Spock combination for Stellas is still really amazing, and there's a lot of just early game use for those guys as well that makes them quite strong. Ston is going into the minor B section. Strike Team Lon is going into an S. It's the captain in the battleship strike team, so definitely really good. Can be hard to source. Again, they made her a lot come from incursions, but that's gotten a tiny bit better now, but is is great. Strike Team Ortega obviously goes with her. I will put her in the S tier as well, as she is pretty crucial to the whole thing, but isn't the best of the three officers. I think the one that is key that will go S plus is Strike Team Una. And the reason that I put her there is she's the one where the tier really matters a lot more, as she's the one that's going to reduce the mitigation of the shield of your opponent. So she starts out, I think, at a 27%. Maybe it's lower than, I forget now. But yeah, I thought it was 27%, but starts out at that rate and then ramps up. So it's a matter of, are you getting fully through your opponent's shield in 2 rounds, 3 rounds, or 4 rounds before you've reduced the mitigation to nothing? The higher tier she is, the quicker that's going to happen there. You're starting it. It's a weird one. It's Scopely math again. You don't start it when it says reduced by 27%. It's not starting at 100. It's starting at 80, because that's what shield mitigation starts at. And then there's a couple researchers that tweak that a tiny bit, but you're taking that value down, and how quickly can you get that to 0? And that's what matters, because that's getting through, and she's the one that makes it happen. Sulu here is going in our only for away teams type category. And then we've got Tall, which I think is at least, I probably got to say he's an S, even though he's got niche uses to some points. There's certain things that you won't be able to do without him. So especially depending on what your level is. If you're trying to really punch up on something like freebooters, if you're trying to really punch up on Actians, collect the most you can, you need him for that, because your ships won't be able to do that with the normal crews. Also in some of the Q trials, again, especially the guys that have had regenerating shields or something kind of strange about them, just a lot of, there's some that just have massive hit point pools, and they may do damage slow, but they just take so much to kill. Tall is really useful for that. The big thing to remember is that anytime you're using Tall with other burning officers, then it will never take more than 20 rounds to kill something. So if you're ever in a fight that you look at the battle log and it was like 40 rounds long, consider switching to Tall and then see if that helped out. Because no matter what, he's going to take that 5% off the hull every round that he has burning. So yeah, if you've got that consistently going, he's going to kill it. So even though he's not super versatile, you won't use him anywhere, he allows you to do things that would be otherwise absolutely impossible for you to do, or unkillable with any other crew. Tal can do it. So I think he does get up there. Tasha Yar really only going to be used for away teams, or sometimes in the rare case of that Troy synergy I was talking about, to help out with Cardassian armadas. The Doctor is probably going to be an A for me. He's a below deck officer that does help out with more loot and more faction and everything that you get for a kill. His sourcing is not very good, and the percentage that he gives is not very good. It's a case where something is better than nothing, so I wouldn't put him higher than an A, because it's a difference. It's a slightly noticeable difference, but like a 10 or 15% increase is really like a 2% increase in reality. But if you're sitting there grinding 1,000 ships just to raise a faction on something, and I said, well, you can kill 2% less of them, you'd probably be interested in doing that. So he's definitely an A, and you've probably, if you've got space for him, he's someone that you're definitely gonna stick on there. And particularly if you're hunting in things where you have to spend a token or something, throw him on there, and you're more likely to fill your hull or fill your hull faster with him. Stock Tilly is gonna go, I think, in that D category here as well. Tiza to me is useless. Talon is going in the S category here. I'm going to say slightly lower than Chen just because she's less universal, but when you need to be fighting things with kinetic damage, she's essentially interchangeable with Chen, but the percentage of what she does is not quite as high. So yeah, it's a little bit of a trade-off. You'd always prefer to be using Chen if all things are equal, but there are many cases where the kinetic does way more, and so you have to switch out for Talon. Tomalak here, maybe in a C category. He's got some use in away team missions. He's not someone that you're typically going to put on ships. It's a shame. He should have probably been better as an officer than some of the other ones. He's a cool character and everything, but he just didn't have the same sort of use. Tom Paris here, I'm going to say is an S tier as well. And he fits in certain niches, but some very powerful ones. So I think early game, before you've maxed out Moreau, or not maxed out, but like before tier 3 or 4, which is, probably going to be for most people into their 30s, having Tom Paris is massively, massively, massively going to help your mitigation, because Moreau has not yet lowered it to lowered the attack of the opponent to a point that you're max mitigation. So Tom Paris is super, super helpful there. He's also super helpful when it comes to Armada stuff, because a lot of the, particularly early game Armada things, but also solar Armadas that you're going to want to do, you may not have mitigation as a component of the officers. So Kirk, Spock, Khan, for instance, contains no actual mitigation in it. It just keeps your shields up. If you then also throw Tom Paris below decks on like a Stella or something, now you have max mitigation and your shield is always up. Your Stella is going to take more than 100 rounds to die. If I just went to a 40 epic Eclipse thing and just sat in front of it, it would take more than 100 rounds for that thing to kill me. If you've got Tom Paris below and Kirk and Spock on the officer side of it there. One sec, I choked on something. But yeah, he's also really good later than that too. So once you get past the Pike Moreau Chen part, into your 50s, you're going to start wanting to use some crews that are pure damage and don't necessarily have the max mitigation on them. The S&W crews are certainly possible, but they don't necessarily maximize out your damage. If you want to be running crit builds and things that are purely offensive, you can stick Tom Paris below there as well, and that's going to max out the mitigation that you need while the crew is completely focused on damage. So I think Tom Paris is one that he got some attention. I've seen some people talk about him. Rev Deuce did a video about him specifically, and I think he said he's important and he's good. I think maybe people are missing some of the potential. I think he's definitely like a top tier guy, and if you're missing out on him, you're going to be missing out on a lot of things that you can do that he is freeing up for you. It's usually been an assumption that your crew has to contain mitigation on it somewhere, and he's going to remove that requirement, and the mitigation can now be below deck. So now you can do crews that you never could have done before, because otherwise they would have simply died immediately to an Armada, or the thing that you're fighting would be completely inefficient or whatever. He's going to give you that ability that's going to allow the rest of what you're doing to make sense. Getting towards the end here, this is super long, but I knew it would be. TOS Chekhov, I guess he's an away team guy. Never used him for anything other than that, but a fairly weak one. TOS Kirk, I am going to put in the. I think he's got to be S tier. He may be low S, but I think he is S tier. Um, Again, because the Explorer strike team kind of sucks, you can use Kirk as the captain or part of a PvP team instead of the Explorer strike team. And I think he's still super strong in that position. He also has a unique thing, which is why you see him used in Rialta versus Rialta fights, where his increase to damage is an actual like numerical one. Instead of being based on the base damage of the ship, it's based on a percentage of the officer stats. So you can be on a ship that basically does 100 damage per shot and stick Kirk on there, and now you're doing 90,000 damage per shot because he's taking the values of the stats of the crew instead of the stats of the ship. So there's really niche uses where that's actually very important. And then his partner, I'll just jump ahead a little bit, is going to be a TOS Uhura. So she is going to cut into the shields a bit. So actually bypass a percentage of the mitigation of the enemy shield or in a PvP fight, not to the extent that Strike Team Una does, where she just reduces it to nothing, but still that ability to cut through is a lot more damage, particularly in PvP, going to the hull as opposed to being absorbed by the shield. So often in these fights, you're going to see that you've killed your opponent even though their shield has not entirely depleted, which you always see in the Strike Team battleship ones, but not usually the others. Here, McCoy, probably a D. I rarely even use him on away teams, but you could. But he's not going to make it onto the ship. TOS Scotty has got to be a little higher than that. The annoying thing with him is, and I think the reason I'll put him in a C, he increases the warp range, but only increases the warp range for explorers and when he's the captain. So unlike Grush and Cadet Scotty, who just increase it as officers, he's got to be the captain, and it's got to be specifically that ship type, which is annoying. But if you're really, really trying to hit max warp range, you can use him. And particularly with Voyager now, Voyager is an explorer, so you can use him on that ship. And that can work out. TOS Spock, I'm going to put him in a heat situation. I'm going to put him in a B. He used to be more important because he lowers the critical damage that your opponent does. But one, it's hard to source him because he's only really effective once you really get him to a high level. Other than that, he's just not lowering it enough to make it worthwhile. But also the game has moved a little beyond that. Even his maximum value is not enough to take a huge amount away from the critical damage your opponent's doing. It will lower it some, but it's just not enough for it to be the thing you want to do. You're probably better off going with the Uhura, trying to get through the shields. Generally speaking, in PvP, if your design, you want to favor doing more damage over lowering their damage, because lowering their damage is usually a losing game. You're better off just killing them before they get to the point they want to, than trying to like survive or wait it out. The fights are just too short for that to be effective, usually. TOS Sulu, probably in the same boat as McCoy there. To Pring, we're going to throw in the minor area. Tuvok is, again, another hyper niche use, literally only has use on Voyager, and is another officer that, like Neelix, is like, we made Voyager's whole like cargo too small on purpose so that we could sell you an officer to increase it. And that's all he does, and that's kind of crap, but that's what he does, and it's useful for that purpose, but it's not good. It doesn't feel good. And then his, even worse, and I think this is why I'll throw him in a C, even worse, apparently his officer ability can actually bug out some of the formation armadas because it doesn't work. Or maybe they fixed it by now, but it wasn't working originally. And apparently using him is some of the reason that you weren't getting chests or something like that. So it just doesn't make sense. Also, what they made it do is he gives you more of the artifact tokens, not the artifacts. So if you're like most players, you've got tons of the artifact tokens, and you're just time gated on how long it takes you to turn them in. So you don't need more of those. You need more of the actual artifacts, and he doesn't do that. So whatever. Then we've got Tyler here. Tyler is, again, next to useless to me, is just kind of an away team guy. Uhura, also kind of an away team person. Vartok is useless. Vel is beyond useless. Vela, again, away team person. Vemet is an away team person. Vixis, I think, falls into useless category. Wesley Crusher is an interesting one where I don't know what the design for him was supposed to be. He's got a very niche away team use on something that you wouldn't really care to level up. And his like officer ability is that he increases his own stats, which just make his stats higher in the first place then. I don't get what the value of him is. I don't get what the design was, but he's just he's just useless. But he's there. Wei Yun, we're going to go back towards the top, and I think he does make an S, despite the fact that he's the least good of the strike team guys. He is the important one out of the three. It's in the other two, it's the rare officer that's actually the does the work. For Wei Yun, it is Wei Yun. And so because of that, you can actually potentially use Wei Yun as a side officer instead of the captain. And I think that gives him more utility because you can mix and match a little bit. You actually do see people using these three together in some cases. And you do see that, like I mentioned before, Wei Yun, Pan, and Marcus as an option, things like that. So I think Wei Yun is the most valuable out of those. William T. Riker used to be, to me, an S tier Armada officer. I think I got to demote him to an A. If you've got the other crews now, they're all better. He was better when things were more focused on the FKR Armadas, that he had a bonus against Federation ones, and he increases the weapons damage that you do for each round. However, I feel like the whole meta has moved that the fights are just shorter and there's more boost to damage from other things and other officers in such a way that 100% each round just doesn't add up to what it used to. There's just stronger options. So he's an okay one, and you can use him with a Picard, Beverly, something like that, and get good results. But there just are better options if you have those officers available. And he can be the captain as well. But again, if you've got better things available, then probably go with those. Riker, Bev, Khan used to be a bit of a thing, but if you've got 5 and 6, 5/6 Khan is just superior in almost every case, particularly if you're not doing the FKRs. And anything beyond that, then yeah, you're better off with that stuff. Worf is an interesting one. He's another one like Crusher. I felt he should have been better than he is, but he's just not. So I just haven't used him for anything. It seems, again, like I guess Honor Guard Worf got all the honor and glory, and Standard Worf got nothing. We're telling there. Yanag actually does sneak in higher. He's got niche use combined with Yuki against Romulans, and can actually get pretty good if you know you're specifically fighting a particular faction. Then he can be useful, but I'd still put him in a C sort of area, because it's going to be a rare situation where you're going to use that, and it's still only if you don't have strike team that you would really turn to that. Yuki is probably going to be our last high-ranking one. I'm going to say A. Yuki is really good against mission hostiles. Yuki would have some some use potentially against some Q trials, and potentially some backup PvP. So Yuki lowers the shields of your opponent each round, and is good with some synergy officers. But and also I think does bonus damage to Romulan as well. So there are situations where Yuki's actually really good if you want to strip the shields off of something over a longer fight. In PvP now, again, fights have gotten shorter and shorter, so it's less valuable because she's not going to have enough time to take the shields completely off the opponent. But against some PvE fights, particularly mission fights, she actually can, where you're going to be in like a 10, 12 round fight, will actually drain that down to nothing, and then everything's hitting the hull, and that could be enough to finish it off in some cases. So niche use and interesting ones, but you wouldn't, unlike Harrison, where I said earlier you use it to bypass shields and get some damage done even if the person lives. Yuki doesn't really serve that purpose, because unless the entire shield is stripped off, it really didn't help. So it's only if you know it's going to be a longer fight, and that's potentially going to be the situation, that she'll help take it all off. Zara is going to sit in useless, and Zhao is a potential synergy officer early game, but eventually will be replaced completely. But I'll put him in, he's really more of a D. Early game use, but then you're not going to get it much there. Actually works with, I think, Yao, Zuki, and Marcus do work out, but Zhao is just kind of along for the ride. So not super high use. So there we go. That was very, very long. I think this is like 2.5 hours long. And so I don't think anyone will watch the entire thing, but maybe you'll click through and find one that you've been thinking about, or whatever. So yeah, I think reasonably bell curved a little bit. I think we've got the most in B, or we got the most in D, I guess, which is next to useless, but I could think of something to do with them. Some of them totally useless. I could have been maybe more brutal to some here, but as you can see, some of them have a away team icon on, so I obviously do use them to some extent. B, pretty bulky, and I think we got kind of a decent curve. Let me know which ones you agree with, disagree with. Is there anyone else that you'd put in the S plus category? Is there anyone that I stuck down here that you think is actually super valuable and you use them all the time, or at least, some niche for it, sort of thing? I think I bet some people will think the miners had more differentiation. I kind of don't. I don't often view, even though, this one's better for this thing and that, I rarely find that it's more than a 5-10% difference in reality when it comes to actually going out and mining things. So, whatever. But yeah, curious if anyone's made it this far through, curious to see what people think. And I do think overall, if I was going to pick just an absolute winner for everything, I think it's 5. I can't make her go. There we go. I think 5 is probably the overall most dominant thing. The best total crew, obviously, is PMC, Pike Moreau Chen. As a total crew, I think that's obviously the strongest. I don't think that's debatable. But I think in terms of the best officer that can actually be in a crew that is good for PvP, armadas, solos, hostile grinding, everything, is going to have to be 5 of 11. So, let me know what you think. And that's it. Way too long.